Hello, and welcome to World Civilizations 1. We are on chapter 16, and we are talking about mature Islamic civilization and the first global civilization. The first thing that I want to point out is I want to talk a little bit about some different ideas of different religious figures. And I saw this really amazing graph that one of my professors at UC actually put together. And at first I wasn't sure that I really, bought it. But then the more I thought about it, I thought, it is a very interesting concept. So it's not something that you have to really buy into if you don't want to. It's just a thought it seems to make sense. So let's take a look at it. So some people believe that religion starts off where God and man is doing pretty well. And I don't know if you've ever heard the quote that, often you never have to ask a dog, okay, to act more like a dog, right? They always act like a dog, or a cat to act like a cat. But oftentimes in history, and even in modern history, we often have to ask humans to act more humanely, all right, because they often forget their humanity, or there's hate involved, and that sort of thing. So it kind of goes along with this graph. So supposed to be, you start out and God and man are harmonious, and then man does something, evil happens, or there's hatred in the world, or there's wars, or they get off track. And then some, scholars believe that, possibly someone like Moses is put into the picture, and then he's supposed to bring man, humanity, and God back in line, or, maybe with the Ten Commandments, or, possibly, things go crazy again, and then here's the mountaintop experience again, where, maybe Jesus was sent. We know his message was one of love and acceptance of the outcast and the marginalized. So then, supposedly gets humanity back on track. And then we have, chaos ensues again. And then maybe we have prophets like Muhammad or Buddha or, Martin Luther, the German monk with Protestantism and the Protestant Reformation. And then life gets crazy again, and humanity is warring and genocide or just different hatreds. And then even in the modern day, some people think people like Martin Luther King Jr. really brought humanity back together again as to their purpose, or like Gandhi as well. Different people in history bring humanity closer to their humanness, and seeing each other as humans, and a part of all humanity. Something else I want to talk about that actually I didn't know until I was much older, and I was very upset because I went to many religious schools and never actually heard this. If you watch your John Green episode, Crash Course World History, it also emphasizes this as well. I believe it's the one on Islam and Muhammad. So basically, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are actually religions that are related. Now, I don't want to say that they are the same religion. That is absolutely not what I'm saying at all. Someone who is Jewish, practicing Judaism, is not at all the same religion as someone who's practicing Christianity. Not at all, okay? We know Judaism believes in the Old Testament, Christianity, the Old and New Testament. And where does Islam fit in? Well, this is where Islam fits in. Islam and the Muslims actually believe the first part of the Bible, creation, Adam and Eve, that sort of thing. And then we get to Abraham is where it splits, all right? And you may or may not have known this, but this is what college is all about. It is all about searching for new information, new truth, just, being exposed to new things that we've never thought about, getting out of our echo chambers where, most of us know kind of the same knowledge, and then, expanding that. So here we get Abraham and Sarah. The story goes they could not have a child, and one was promised, and they were 90 and 100. And so Abraham and Sarah decided to take it in their own hands. And in the culture and the time of the day, oftentimes you would take a servant wife, which would be like a concubine. And we've had concubines mentioned in our world history book. So he took Hagar and he had a son with her, and his name was Ishmael, and he is actually the father of the Arab nation, and that's where Islam took hold, and also Muhammad was Arabian. Over here on this side, so when Ishmael, I believe, was 13, Sarah actually had a baby, had Isaac, and they were much older than each other. I'm sorry, Ishmael was much older than Isaac, and so Isaac was born, and Isaac is the father of the Jews, and that's where, Judaism comes through this line and Islam from this line. And that may not be something that you know or had heard before, because I really hadn't, and I was really surprised and kind of upset that I hadn't heard it before. Also, John Green also talks about in your Crash Course World History that when they were translating, when Western scholars were translating Allah, in the Arabic over into English, they left the Arabic word, which is Allah, instead of translating it to God. So actually it is considered the same God. It's just not the same religion. It is not, just like Judaism and Christianity are not the same religion. So I just want you to make sure that you understand that. And, but it could be translated God, the same of the Old Testament. All right, because these two are related, okay? So that's just something that was really important to go over and to understand before we delve into more of our lesson. And the quote at the top of the page says, "We believe in God and what has been sent down to us, and was sent down to Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, and their descendants, and what was given Moses, Jesus, and the prophets by the Lord." And that's actually from the Quran. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint and we'll finish the lesson. Thank you. Hi, and now we're going to go back to the PowerPoint right now. So I'm going to switch us. Okay, so here we go, and we're going to go through our PowerPoint. Okay, mature Islamic civilization and first global civilization. The painting from the 16th century shows that although law and theology were the foremost Islamic schools, sciences such as mathematics, astronomy, and medicine also remained popular among Muslim scholars and often benefited from the patronage of caliphs and sultans. All right. Okay, you have some different caliphates. And the Mongols plunder Baghdad. The Abbasids moved their lavish court to Baghdad. It was a cosmopolitan center of trade, culture, manufacturing, and they really encouraged education and Western thought and classical things from Greece. The Baghdad libraries were full of just all kinds of information and education from all over the world. They maintained the equality, their goals were to maintain the equality of all Muslims, whether Arab, Persian, provide religious leadership. Religious scholars were the ulama, supported by the Abbasids. They developed the Sharia, which is a sacred law, based on the Quran and the Sunnah, examples set by Muhammad, affected both public and private life of Muslims. The state bureaucracy, the Diwan was the state council, the vizier was the prime minister, emir is a provincial governor, and the qadis were judges in cases involving Muslims. So what they did is they paid taxes if you were Christian or Jewish, and you could worship for small amounts of taxes. You could worship whatever God you wished. And this idea and this thought that Muslims wanted to convert you actually was not true in world history, because if they got rid of all of the other religions, then there would be no tax base. Also, it's interesting to note that the judges in the cases involving Muslims, okay? So then you could also, if you were paying that tax, if something happened, you would be in the court of the Jews if you were Jewish, or in a Christian court if you were a Christian. Army used slave soldiers taken from conquered people for the development of Islamic religious thought. Islamic law became conservative in the 10th century. That's when it kind of clamped down and came a little legalistic. Closing the gates discouraged independent thought and innovation, whereas before it was wide open. Sufism, remember we've talked about before that 3% of religion is the extremists, and then you have 6% on the other end that's very, very loving, and those were the Sufis. Mystics is what they call them in Christianity. They sought direct personal relationship with God, used dance and music to achieve ecstasies, whirling dervishes. Al-Ghazali, renewer of Islam. The tariqas were Sufi religious associations. Okay. Further development of Islamic religious thought. Arabic language became source of unification. Quran could only be written in Arabic. That's really kind of a cultural tradition. Only read and written in Arabic to truly understand it. Every educated Muslim learned it. Acquired paper from the Chinese. Had a paper factory in Baghdad. University was also the Muslim creation, and that university is still in practice today. Al-Azhar in Cairo. I mean, you can still go visit it. It began out of a mosque. Caliphs patronized translation of Greek and Sanskrit works into Arabic. Many of those works were lost or burned in different battles and wars and earthquakes. And so some of those writings from ancient Greek and ancient Rome were saved simply because the Islamic scholars copied them. Okay. Natural sciences, Muslim valued Greek learning, especially Aristotle. They loved Aristotle. Muslim scientists excelled in pharmacology, physiology, anatomy, ophthalmology, astronomy. Arab and Persian travelers wrote on geography and culture. Muslims transmitted Arabic numerals, concepts of algebra and decimal system. You have to understand, while Europe was in the Dark Ages, because of the extreme control of the church, there was no trade, there was no learning really taking place at all. Peasants were not allowed to read or write. You have the Islamic Empire and the Indian Empire and the Chinese Empire having a golden age of learning and booming of all kinds of subjects. Okay, let's see. Islamic scientists and thinkers. Okay. The arts in the Muslim world. Now you need to understand that you're not in the Muslim world. You were never allowed to kind of do portraits because they didn't want you to worship different pictures of Muhammad. So oftentimes you don't see his face. But what they did is they developed other artistic avenues instead. So no sculpture, no portraits, even though there's some miniature paintings and some small designs. But mostly the arts grew in architecture, beautiful forms. The Taj Mahal is an example, formal gardens and reflecting pools, calligraphy, beautiful poetry, and storytelling, oral traditions, and poems. Right. Persian literature was popular, Arab storytelling, 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights, and poetry was valued. Arts in the Muslim world, marriage and status of women. Position of women declined as Muslims adopted the practice of keeping women veiled and in seclusion. That wasn't something that was at the beginning. It was something that came later as laws were clamped down upon and codified. Number of wives was limited to 4. But no limit on the slave concubines. And what you have to understand is, today many progressive Muslims will say that was written in a time of war, and there were different clans fighting among the Arab people, and so there were many widows, and so the rule was only 4 wives. Only if you could provide for them, only if you could feed the children and take good care of your wives. And it was really to make sure that women and children were not out where they would die of starvation. And also, this is a tradition in the Jewish culture as well. If you look at different kings in the Old Testament, I believe King Solomon had 1,000 wives, 700 wives, and 300 concubines, and David had 500 plus. So you have that, the many wives tradition. Slavery was common. Most households had slaves in the home and the shop. So slavery was common, but it wasn't grueling work where it short-lived the slave's life. They weren't going to the galleys, manning oars in a boat. They weren't going to silver mines. They weren't actually out harvesting crops, which would shorten their lifespan and be worked to death. So that was not happening. The Sharia did not allow enslavement of Muslims. Also, in your book, it talks about that they could not enslave someone of foreigners. They were not supposed to enslave foreigners. The Sharia did come later, the law, so that was a change as well. Usually, a household had one slave, and it was someone that worked in the home or the shop. Elite women were more restricted than the lower class women, much like what it was in the early European 1600s and the U.S. 1600s. Okay, marriage and the status of women. Only the Oriental scripts rival the beauty of written Arabic. Several different styles involved in different places and times. Quite as distinct as the various alphabets of the Western world. Here is the 11th century Persian script, and that is beautiful. The decline of the Abbasids. Spain, North Africa, Arabia broke away in the 1800s. Seljuk Turks invaded the Middle East. The Caliph became a figurehead. Empire fragmented into small principalities. Genghis Khan and the Mongols, a new threat. Nomadic horse-based people from Central Asia conquered most of Central Asia. His successor conquered the Russians. Then the Mongols eventually took Baghdad, burning everything, even the scrolls and scripts. But there were so many libraries all across the Islamic empire that many works were saved. Something also that's really interesting, I'm not sure if we mentioned it yet, but I know it's in your book. If you were in the Middle Ages and from Europe and on a manor, you were never allowed to leave. So then you take that and contrast it with the Islamic world, and you could travel no matter if you were poor or rich. So that's why we have some of the greatest stories of exploration from Ibn Battuta, who was a wealthy religious scholar and was able to visit many, many, many places on his way to Mecca, his Hajj. Took him 24 years to just travel all over the world and come home. And he was from Morocco. Islamic civilization flourished. From 900 to 1200, Islam, most lavish and innovative civilization, rivaled only by China and India. Extensive commercial and intellectual contacts allowed Islam to become a world religion. Honest merchants were much more highly honored, where in the past, merchants were looked at as like con men. First, world civilization. Trade routes in Muslim communities extended throughout the known world. Muslims were facilitated, world facilitated the travel. Muslims had the freedom of movement, whereas Europeans did not. During the Dark Ages, there was no trade and no learning in the European world, and there was tons of trade and tons of learning in the Muslim world. Annual pilgrimage to Mecca was an opportunity to share heritage and latest inventions. Rich cosmopolitan cities of great learning, Cordoba, Granada, Baghdad. And Cordoba was awesome because Cordoba was in Spain, and it had 3 corridors. It had the Christians, it had a large corridor of Jews and of Muslims, and they actually shared information and texts and libraries, and they weren't trying to convert each other or change each other's minds or their religions. They were just learning. And so they actually were, before Spain kicked them out, the Jews and the Muslims, with the Spanish Inquisition, they were actually translating the Quran into Hebrew and the Quran into Spanish for the Christians to read, and they were translating the Bible and the Old Testament into Arabic for them to share and exchange knowledge. Very cool. Got to go there before I die. Okay. Beautiful architecture. First world civilization. In this time period, the Islamic community extended from the Atlantic to Southeast Asia. By 1200, the Baghdad caliphs a hold onto territories beyond Arabia and Iraq was minimal. It existed at all. Persia and Egypt, as well as Spain and Afghanistan, were autonomous under their own shahs and caliphs. African Muslims never had direct contact with Baghdad. Now, also, we talk a lot about Ibn Battuta, and I believe that you also read about his world traveling, and he traveled that Islamic empire. It was fantastic. Almost identical to that. I believe that there's a map for you to look at there. Okay, so hopefully you learned some different things, and there's a movie that you watched. Also, you probably watched something on George Bush and his 6 days after September 11th, he got in front of the whole country and said that Islam is peace. And really, that is not something that Westerners have actually ever heard before. It's kind of foreign to us. But the true message of Muhammad was peace. And it's so interesting if you do some research on the different mosques in Cincinnati. I believe the mosque in Cincinnati raised $1 million, might have been $2 million, for those who were the families of the victims in September 11th, to just give to them, to help them cope with what happened, because that is not the Islam or the peaceful God or the peaceful religion that they follow. And those terrorists actually were from Saudi Arabia, which is, that's one part of the many Islamic countries in the world. So anyway, hopefully that gives you some more understanding, and we'll be talking about the Mongols next, I think. Have a great day.